Liberty in our lifetimes in a free state of our own. That's the vision. That's the dream. And we are building it in New Hampshire. I'm Eric Brakey, your host and renegade statesman for the Porcupine Report. Welcome to your source for porcupine news and free-range conversation on matters of liberty. All right, let's hop into the show. Hey there, all you porcupines, this is your host, your renegade statesman, your executive director of the Free State Project in the Granite State of New Hampshire, the Free State, Eric Brakey. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Of course, as you know, every single Wednesday, we come to you with a brand new episode at 7 o'clock p.m. This one is episode 45. And so I really appreciate you tuning in, whether you are watching on the platform formerly known as Twitter, on Facebook, on Spotify, on YouTube, wherever you are consuming this show. We appreciate having you in the audience. And one thing you could do to help is to leave a like or a nice comment or a nice review, share it with your friends, whatever makes sense for the platform you are enjoying this content. It helps us grow the audience, and it's very much appreciated. And your friends will be grateful to you too. Don't they want to be getting this wonderful Liberty content directly to their phone or computer every single Wednesday at 7 o'clock? Frankly, if you aren't sharing this with your friends, I wonder if you're really a good friend to them. They need this content. So go ahead and share it with your friends, your family, your neighbors even. Anyone who loves liberty, we'd love to have them part of our audience at the Porcupine Report. And I will also note before we get to the meat and potatoes of our episode today that I'm glad to be back in New Hampshire. I did so much traveling through November from Texas to Tennessee to Ohio and now back home to New Hampshire. Glad to be here in the Free State. It is, of course, we're approaching the end of the year. It's fundraising season for nonprofits like the Free State Project. And right now we are fundraising for our Granite Gulch initiative, which is some efforts we are planning to initiate in the new year to do more, to beef up our recruitment, to grow our community, and to brand the Free State in the minds of all who love liberty as the place to call home. We're seeking to raise $180,000 by the end of the year. We have one generous donor who has pledged to match everything we raise up to $90,000 dollar for dollar. So if we get that full match, that means we will hit our goal, and we are halfway there. We've raised $45,000 so far since the day after Election Day, which is being matched. So that's a total of $90,000. So if we can raise a final $45,000 before the end of the year, we're going to be in great shape going into 2025 to grow the impact of the Free State movement and continue to achieve liberty in our lifetime. So you can go to fsp.org/give and make your most generous contribution. It's greatly appreciated. And while you're there at our website, be sure to check out our community calendar to see all of the many events that are taking place in New Hampshire for lovers of liberty almost every single day. And coming up, it's approaching us before you know it. Next year, we're going to be having the New Hampshire Liberty Forum in April and the Porcupine Freedom Festival in June. Tickets are on sale now, and you're going to want to make sure to get yours. So find out all of that at fsp.org. All right, let's get into the rest of the show. I want to welcome back to the program a guest who was on in the early days. I don't know if we'd even gotten to episode 10 the last time he was on. Here we are at episode 45. We're chugging along. His name is Sean Themea. He is the Chief Operating Officer at Young Americans for Liberty, a former colleague of mine during my days working at this important institution for the liberty movement. And I invited Sean on because, we've done on this show a series of episodes about what just happened, reflecting on the recent elections. We talked with Jack Hunter about what just happened on a national level with the huge dust up with Congress and the White House. We had an episode with Michael Granger of the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance talking about what just happened more locally, close to home in New Hampshire. But we're bringing on today Sean Themea to talk about what just happened across all of the states. Because for those who know, Young Americans for Liberty know that they are one of the most effective organizations working on a national level, mobilizing activists to get involved in state legislative races and get Liberty legislators elected to state capitals around the country. And their Hazlitt Legislator Coalition is now over 400 strong. Of course, about a quarter of that are folks in New Hampshire, as you would expect. But other states are doing impressive things too, and we're going to talk about all of that with Sean Themea of Young Americans for Liberty. So, Sean, welcome to the Porcupine Report.
Reiki, thanks for having me back. Good to be here.
Well, it was good to see you and all the folks at Young Americans for Liberty while I was down in Texas for a little bit just a few weeks ago. I know for those watching closely the video version of this show, they might recognize the background of your video that you're coming in from, because that was where I was just a few weeks ago. Actually, when I was interviewing Michael Granger about what just happened in New Hampshire. So we'll be talking about what just happened around the country. So first of all, Sean, I guess for those who aren't familiar with Young Americans for Liberty, which they should be, I don't know why they aren't. Shame on them, but we'll catch them up to speed. Tell everyone about Young Americans for Liberty, the work that's being done, and why does Young Americans for Liberty exist? What do you do?
Young Americans for Liberty was born out of Students for Ron Paul in 2008. After the Ron Paul campaign concluded, there was so much excitement about Dr. Paul's campaign that we decided, with his blessing, to parlay that into Young Americans for Liberty to maintain the movement on college campuses for Ron's ideas, the ideas of limited government, peace, and prosperity. And we evolved into more than just a student campus-based organization. We evolved into a political machine, and we're the only group out there right now that builds, elects, and passes. We build a youth army of college students across the country, the leaders of tomorrow, who understand the ideas of liberty and are excited to take action. And then we go out and we elect liberty legislators at the state level. We get these students on campaigns with great partners who turn out the vote and help elect champions to the state houses and state senates across the country through a program we called Operation Win at the Door. But election day isn't the end of the political process. We have to pass legislation. So these students and these legislators, they work together, they team up in order to try and get transformative legislation through these state capitals and onto the governor's desks. Things like universal school choice, total tax repeal, total tax abolition, reforming and abolishing civil asset forfeiture, many such things that take into account our civil liberties, our peace, our prosperity, our well-being, truly transformative liberty legislation that is going to slash the size and scope of government. So that's what Young Americans for Liberty is setting out to do, building this youth army so we can transform states across the country into beacons of freedom.
I certainly, when I look back at where things were on the state legislative level across the country 10 years ago, it often seems to me like, I remember when I first ran for the state Senate, and it seemed like a novel idea at the time, a Ron Paul influenced legislator, someone running for state office, rather than, everyone seemed to be throwing so much time and energy and resources into congressional races and U.S. Senate races. And of course, there's a place for those. But I felt like we weren't, it was very disappointing back then. We weren't racking up the wins like we would hope. Everyone was so focused on Washington, D.C. But there were maybe a few, maybe a dozen, maybe a little more, depending on how you count it, of kind of liberty legislators in state capitals. I think New Hampshire's always been an outlier in that regard versus a lot of other states. But today, to see that, I remember it was an ambitious goal when Young Americans for Liberty a few years back said they were going to get 250 liberty legislators elected in state capitals. And you haven't quite doubled that yet, but you are on the way. You're well over 400 now. I guess, could you talk a little bit about, I guess before we talk about what just happened specifically this election cycle, like what has that growth been like for Young Americans for Liberty building this legislator coalition?
It's been truly tremendous. Thanks to great funders, great partner organizations, and of course, our student army, and all of these people who are stepping up and saying, I'm going to run for office, and I'm going to run not just to get reelected and elected to higher office, but I'm going to run to challenge my own party, leadership in my own party, and actually try and make effective change happen to reduce the size and scope of government. All these things working together have been so heartening. It's a total white pill to see this movement grow. But we have been 10xing our legislative coalition size since 2018. Like you alluded to, in 2018, we wrapped up that election cycle with about 40 members in our coalition, 40 tracked elected legislators in state houses across the country who we deemed could be the next Ron Pauls, folks who would challenge leadership, folks who were principled, folks who were viable, folks who can make a great floor speech in the cause of liberty. And that number has now exceeded 400, right? So in just a couple of election cycles, we've gone from 40 to 400, and sky's the limit. And, ultimately, whether that number is 1,000, 2,000, there's 5,411 state house seats across the country last time I checked, right? But like Sam Adams said, a small, vocal, irate minority of people can create brush fires, in this country, to paraphrase him. And so I really do think this 400 coalition of liberty legislators can fundamentally transform how we see this country simply by taking over a couple of states and creating a reverse California, creating a liberty lighthouse state with so much good legislation passed that all the other red states are turning and looking at them and saying, hey, what are they doing over there in Wyoming? What are they doing over there in Idaho? I think we can do this here now that they've shown us the way
Of course, in
how
New
to get all
Hampshire,
these
too.
bills passed. And maybe even New Hampshire too, right? Of course, I gotta give a shout out for the hometown or the home state. Born and raised in Chester.
Well, let me ask you. You mentioned some of the policy victories. Obviously, I think we look at the rise of school choice around the country, and I don't know that we would see it happening, the implementation happen on a state level, if it wasn't for the work that Young Americans for Liberty was doing. To see this idea that had really maybe always just lived in the writings of Milton Friedman in kind of a theoretical realm where money can follow the students rather than just being funneled from bureaucracy to bureaucracy. To see that has, of course, New Hampshire is leading the way on that, but other states like Missouri and West Virginia, places where YAL has a strong presence with liberty legislators, has been really kind of making the way. What do you see kind of when a state passes something like school choice or I know, a revolution that seems to be nearly completed in one, which was constitutional carry, once a radical idea in only a few states, now over half the country has it. What do you see as far as like when you can get a libertarian policy enacted, a significant libertarian policy enacted in a state? What do you see in terms of the domino effects and the value of that as a model that can be used around the country?
Well, certainly a tremendous model, like you alluded to. Constitutional carry, once a couple of states had passed that, the legislators in other states and the constituents too said, hey, they have it here. Why don't we have it here? And so there's a grassroots momentum that nationally builds once these dominoes start falling. It really comes down to how much pressure can you inflict on leadership in the Republican Party in these red states to get libertarian policy legislation passed, right? Because the greatest impediment to transformative limited government legislation is speakers of the House, it's committee chairs, Senate presidents who would rather avoid controversy and avoid taking big steps, maybe ruffling the feathers of their special interest colleagues. Those are the people who are impeding this legislation being passed. And so once you get one state passing a bill, right, if you can mobilize the grassroots, if you are sitting out there and speaking, I guess, to the folks in New Hampshire, for example, next year with, right to work, for example, which, could see a vote in the legislature next year. The difference between that bill passing or not might just be if you pick up the phone and start dialing your state rep, your state senator to say, we need this. And if you don't provide it, then you might not win your seat next cycle, right? So it comes from the grassroots. It comes from pressure on those in leadership. But certainly it's a lot easier to see these bills pass once one domino falls. And I think a lot of folks are pointing to, for example, Arizona, the first state to pass that universal school choice. They can look at that and say, look at the Arizona model. We can do that here. Much easier to see those bills, get through the process and get grassroots support once one state has set it in stone.
So, if I remember from the Hazlitt Policy Summit, which I was honored to join, even though I am an exiting state legislator, you all still invited me to come join the with all these other Liberty legislators. So that was it was great to see everyone and hear about the victories that were taking place. If I remember right, there was a stat thrown out from this election that like 50% of all the incumbents across the country that lost their reelections were incumbents who were ran against a Young Americans for Liberty backed candidate. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes. Half of the incumbents at the state level, RINO incumbents, lost at the hands of Make Liberty Win PAC, which is a sister organization to Young Americans for Liberty Political Action Committee, running up against a candidate who was part of the Hazlitt Coalition. So you see this great RINO exodus in 2024, right? We can talk about some of the great results of the general on the state level that never made it to the headlines. But before we get to that, I think it's important to recognize that 2024 was the year of the RINO hunt. And we saw that not just in some states, but many states, right? Texas, tons of legislators who ran against school choice, right? They're gone. It's about 7 RINOs who are dispatched out in Texas. West Virginia, the Senate president and lieutenant governor, right? Thought to be untouchable. He's gone. In Wyoming, you saw mass exodus of RINOs, and now you've got a majority of the Republican caucus in the state House and state Senate is either a Hazlitt Coalition member with Yao or a Freedom Caucus member, right? So that state, very optimistic about because you've got a majority of the party now who is a Liberty legislator. In Ohio, you had this thing called the Blue 22, right? These 22 Republicans who teamed up with Democrats to elect a uniparty speaker, someone who would kill legislation, who was just committed to being a squish. 9 of those folks gone. The most incumbents ousted in Ohio in one sitting in over 30 years. So you've got just this tremendous exodus of RINOs across the country, in no small part, I think, to the grassroots and the voters waking up to the fact that just because someone has an R by their name does not mean they're actually going to vote to limit government. But also thanks to the hard work of Young Americans for Liberty trained door knockers going out there, turning out the vote. And also in thanks to the candidates, these real citizen legislators who are stepping up, who are saying, I'm going to take on the Leviathan. I'm going to take on the beast, the untouchable, right? The person who's going to outraise me 10-1, the person with name ID, who I know's record, is terrible. And I'm going to run on that and how I'm going to be a champion. And we're seeing the truth win out across the country in these races, and people who are just fed up with an establishment Republican Party who will do nothing to keep their promises and limit government. People are ready for change.
It is kind of wonderful to see. What do you expect to potentially happen over the course of the next 2 years with kind of this this growth in the legislative coalition? I'm certain. I mean, it's fascinating, right? I think that there's a lot of great kind of think tanks out there who do a lot of great work theorizing about policies that could be passed and implemented. But when it comes, and they can show up and testify in a public hearing and say why something is a good idea, and then get ignored by all of the people who hold office because for whatever reason they're not motivated. But it certainly seems like what does motivate office holders is the threat of losing their reelections, which Yao has demonstrated it has the capacity to mobilize voters and activists to toss people out who stand in the way of restoring freedom. What do you expect to see the next 2 years with the Liberty coalitions that are in place? And do you think that as you call them, the RINO politicians who remain will start acting differently, knowing that they've seen so many of their colleagues lose their jobs?
Yeah, well, I think that, they say first they laugh at you, then they ignore you, then they fight you, then you win. All right. I got the order right there, right? That is the order.
I think that's right. Yeah.
We're definitely in the, then they fight you stage of this, right? We saw in particular in Wyoming and Idaho this past year, establishment media coming, negative coverage of what we were doing, these legislators that we were targeting, and even post-election saying, beware, now that these liberty legislators have won, there's doom that will be taking over in the Capitol. So they're scared. They're trying to decredit these legislators. Wyoming in particular, we've got a great beat reporter in Wyoming who's pumping out article after article, projecting all this doom. And she happens to be the former communications lead for Liz Cheney, the great Liz Cheney. And so we, judge us by our enemies, right? But I do think that what we can see is compound interest, and I think a real sense of unity across the country, unity that will lead to results. At the Hazlitt Policy Summit that Young Americans for Liberty Foundation hosted back in November, we had over 200 legislators who showed up from over 33 states, right? The weekend before Thanksgiving, right? So peak time, right, for busyness. We had hundreds of folks come out and say, I'm ready to learn. I'm ready to strategize, collaborate, learn from other legislators across the country. One legislator who was just elected in Ohio, again, who was outraised 10-1, faced the brunt of the media. She was just so happy. She said, I don't feel alone anymore, right? I'm realizing that I'm part of something bigger. I'm part of this movement. I'm going to double down. So I think it's so important for folks to recognize who are in office, who are seeking to run for office and take on, the Leviathan, take on the establishment, that you're not alone. There are people here who will support you. There are brothers and sisters in arms. And I think the results of this are going to be kind of like how crypto, for a while is pacing, then it takes off. And there's a ton of gains. I think you're going to see that with the legislation, in these coming years. Once these state capitals continue to have more and more liberty legislators in tow, the establishment gets weaker and weaker, and all of a sudden more and more bills will keep passing. And I think 2025, you're going to see a lot of bills passing in that session. And there's already been over 700 liberty bills passed by members of Young Americans for Liberty's coalition, including universal school choice, abolishing civil asset forfeiture, constitutional carry in several states. So I think the compound interest is going to just keep growing, and we're going to see tremendous gains.
Now, you've mentioned right to work, which I know is a big push in New Hampshire, and I think that with the resounding victories of liberty legislators and just Republican, the general kind of Republican caucus kind of growth in control over the legislature in New Hampshire. New Hampshire probably is kind of set up to become the first right to work state in New England. We'll see. You never want to count your chickens before they hatch. I hope I don't jinx it, because certainly
knocking wood right now.
Yeah, certainly the union bosses are going to be doing everything they can to fight against it, because of course, I think as we've seen, once you get right to work passed in one state in a region, it tends to create pressure on other states around them to pass something similar as jobs leave and flow into the state with a right to work law. So I know that's a big push. What are some, and you've mentioned school choices continues to be a big push in many states that aren't as fortunate as Arizona and New Hampshire and a few others to have it. What are some other kind of big legislative issues you expect people should be watching out for the next 2 years that are going to be playing out in state capitals?
Absolutely. Well, one of the threads of this answer is something I know you and I have talked about a lot, and our colleagues have talked about a lot, but it's the idea that public opinion does not necessarily match up with public policy. Right? With right to work in particular, if you ask someone, should you be forced to join a union, have those union dues be paid to the opposing party, or maybe just a political party you don't want anything to do with, 90% of people say, of course not, right? And why is right to work not the law of the land? It's because these powerful people in the establishment, the union bosses of special interest, they get in the way. And I think a lot of the liberty legislation you're going to see that gets passed and gets fought for over these next few years, will match up with public opinion very strongly, bipartisan, nonpartisan. For example, property tax abolition. Right. The notion of, you achieve the American dream, you pay off your house, you get a house, you pay the mortgage, you pay it off, and then you're forced to pay 5 figures for the rest of your life just to have the right to own your home. It seems ridiculous. And when you pull back the onion, you do the math, you see that these taxes aren't even necessary in many of these states. They're either being funneled towards slush funds and ridiculous programs, or it's just, going to surplus income, and we don't even need to collect these taxes in the first place. So I think sunlight is going to be the best disinfectant for property tax repeal and could usher in a whole new era of the American dream and home ownership across the country. So expect that to be fought for in a couple of states next session. There's some states that have grocery taxes. I think you're fortunate in New Hampshire to not have that, but several states have extra taxes just for groceries in particular. And it's a total just power grab, total cash grab. People have been lulled into the sense of thinking, oh, this is necessary and this is normal, but you could easily repeal that tax, and to have inflation and then a grocery tax on top of that, it's ridiculous. So I think tax repeal across the board, income tax in some states as well, is going to be big, going to be fought for. We talked about universal school choice as well and right to work. So I think especially in this era of, we've lived through Biden inflation the last 4 years, the money printer has gone burr, people are fed up, and the grassroots is ready to start keeping their money back in their pocket, away from these politicians who have failed them. And I think that if you zero in and you target a lot of these tax abolitions, and that could be momentum for, additional adjacent legislation moving forward. So it could be a big year for the economy in 2025.
Awesome. And what do you think? So we've talked about kind of the history of kind of how we got here. We've talked a lot about, what just happened in these elections. There's always so much focus on Washington, D.C. and what's going on there. We always get our hopes up for kind of great change, and hey, maybe we'll get some good change. We'll see what happens. But what role do you see kind of in the long term, maybe define that? Let's say that over the next decade, that state legislatures play in the overall conversation about the direction of our country and the policies that inform what it means to live in it.
Yeah, I think it definitely can be the ultimate civics lesson that COVID really showed us, if nothing else, that it's the people in the state capitol, the governors, the state reps, even the local level, have more power over your day-to-day life than Washington, D.C. does. Because, although D.C., had a role in the pandemic, it was, the governors and the state legislators who were saying, you need to stay in your house. You have to wear the mask, right? Even in these deep red states, Shelley Luther in Texas, salon owner, she ultimately went to jail because of Greg Abbott's mask mandate, right? Conservative Abbott, his mask mandate. So it's a wake-up call for a lot of folks that, hey, a lot of threats to our freedom happen at the state level. But also the silver lining is that you have much more power and influence over your state legislator and your state politics than you do DC, both in the that goes into these races and also just the direct line of, universe, right? Again, like I said earlier, think if 2 dozen people called their state rep today, that could shake them into maybe changing their vote to actually vote for the Liberty Bill. So to your question of, what is the role that state legislators play against DC in the long run? I think that we're going to continue to see, right? Even though I'm cautiously optimistic about many aspects of the incoming administration, I think in the long run, we're going to continue to see that Washington, D.C. is not going to solve our problems, that the deep state and the swamp is so entrenched that it is to a point unfixable to where we need to fix it. And that if we want to preserve our future for our children, true solutions, right, it's going to come from the states. It's going to come from, shaking up the state legislatures, from being able to repeal these taxes, right, repeal these provisions on, government schooling and forcing kids into government school, the threats to our civil liberties like civil asset forfeiture. We have the power to do that in the states. And I think that in the long run, people are going to say, oh, wow, like I can make real change happen right here, right now in the states. I'm going to start ignoring Washington and focus on where I live.
Well, and in the vein of ignoring Washington, obviously there are so many policies we pursue on a state level that are just improvements on state policy. Right to work is that's a perfectly understandable state level change. Constitutional carry, fighting civil asset forfeiture. These are changes to state policy. What do you see as the possibility with so many liberty legislators influenced by the Ron Paul message on the prospect of nullification of unconstitutional federal policies that may be in place that could range from gun control to cannabis prohibition to so many things in between. Even defend the guard, calling home troops from wars that haven't been declared by Congress. What do you think there's a real appetite from folks in the HAZA coalition to directly challenge unconstitutional federal power?
100%, right? I think that is a core outcome of these state legislatures being filled with HAZA coalition members. And we see this on the left, right? The left likes to talk a lot about, how crazy, the right or the liberty folks would be for nullification or doing such things. But they're already doing it with, sanctuary cities, right? And ultimately defying federal orders and saying, we're going to, preserve these cities as, safe places, for folks who aren't citizens. The liberty folks can do that too. And we're doing it with, Second Amendment Preservation Act, right? And saying, hey, if there's federal overreach for gun grabs, with these states and these cities are not going to follow them, right? We see that where you alluded to, what did you just allude to?
Oh, what with gun control and
gun
defend
control
the guard and cannabis prohibition?
Yeah, with cannabis prohibition as well. And I think you see it, dare I say, even for certain, crazy tax overreach and certain economic overreach. You could say, no, actually, this is ridiculous. We're not going to do that. And so I think across the board, the states have the potential to restore this country to the founders' intent, right? Which was, it's the United States of America, right? Not the United Washington, D.C. military industrial conglomerate of America. So I think nullification is definitely something that we could get excited about and see, very peacefully enacted in some of these states.
Yeah, it's interesting. Of course, you mentioned like the sanctuary cities, like policies as kind of an example of it. Of course, that's something that the left has been pursuing to, I guess you could call it nullification of federal law. But I think what's interesting is that I know that the nullification efforts that are generally pursued by the liberty movement tend to be things that are unconstitutional federal powers, where we didn't give in Article 1, Section 8 the power to prohibit a plant or to restrict people's firearms or to send troops abroad in wars that haven't been declared or so on and so forth. But of course, it is interesting that like when the left is focused on sanctuary city policies, like we actually did give the federal government the constitutional power over naturalization into this country. So I think there's certainly a much stronger constitutional argument for the policy efforts of the liberty movement than what we're seeing from the progressive movement. But I suppose,
of course, they don't want to hear that. But they'll learn in time. In time, I think some of them will.
Yeah.
You did make, if I could jump back, you did make
go back.
Point, in your earlier remarks about Ron Paul's influence, and I think that again, I'm cautious. I'm a born skeptic. I'm cautiously optimistic about the incoming admin, especially, compared to, Kamala administration, we forget about it. But the fact that, you have Doge, you have Vivek and Elon who are saying, hey, Ron is inspiring us. We want Ron's advice on how to slash government. Huge win, right? Ron left DC, I think at least 12 years ago, 13 years ago at this point. But the fact that now he is, metaphorically back in there.
Return of the Jedi.
Exactly. I think that is just the first of many things to come when it comes to Ron Paul's influence in DC and continuing these states living on. I mean, the legislators who were at the HAZA Policy Summit in the HAZA Coalition, they are directly inspired by Ron himself. They're in his image. Obviously, incredible person to live up to. No one's quite like him. But I think this Dr. No spirit of, making the case of why we need to read the bills, why voting no is usually the right answer, why government cannot really create, it can only destroy, citing him in floor speeches. And I think the more people in the coalition too, right, while I would encourage everybody to make an impact in their state, inevitably they're going to run, for federal office, many of them. You already have Eric Burleson in Congress, who was part of the coalition. Many such other folks, I think, in the future who can make it to DC. And I think that you're going to see a lot of Ron Paul acolytes in the long term making their way back into Washington while also making an impact in the state. So very optimistic on the future of, Ron's living a legacy carrying out through the HAZA coalition.
You mentioned Eric Burleson. I think that's a nice note. First has a coalition member to make it to Congress. God knows a few others have tried, but Eric kind of broke through, and I really appreciated actually connecting with him at the Young Americans for Liberty convention earlier this year and talking with him about the case of Ross Ulbricht. And he didn't know too much about it. He learned about it, of course, here in New Hampshire. We're all very passionate about seeing Ross Ulbricht free, as Donald Trump has promised to commute his sentence on day one. We'll see if he follows through on that promise. And I appreciated that Eric Burleson signed on to the letter for Ross's freedom. And it just kind of goes to show that when you have good people who kind of come out of this libertarian tradition, while the real focus to saving America is in the state legislatures, it certainly is nice to have a few people who do make it to Congress who can advocate for change inside the imperial city. And when you mention Ron Paul being an advisor to DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency under Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, I suppose I'm skeptical a little bit about if they'll succeed in making kind of real change to transformative change to how much money the Washington, D.C. is spending and wasting. But boy, it is nice to see that at least it appears to be a sincere effort. And at least they're injecting kind of conversations about the overspending and the debt back into the narrative, which I feel like we've lost since the death of the Tea Party. Really since I think 2016 on, it just Democrats didn't want to talk about cutting spending, and Republicans didn't want to talk about cutting spending anymore. It's nice to see that coming back in, and the godfather of the Tea Party movement, Ron Paul, is back in the conversation on this.
Yes, as he should be, because as we know, he was right all along. To your other point about in the election, right? We talked about primaries. Obviously, we talked about the Washington, D.C. outcomes. Some things that may not have made the headlines, I think would be very interesting. And folks in New Hampshire are acutely aware. In New Hampshire, state went federally blue, but the Republican majority was defended and expanded. State House, State Senate, and Kelly Ayotte for governor. And the primaries in New Hampshire, most of the RINOs who lost their reelections were folks who voted against right to work. So I think that's already foreboding and telling in a good way, or foretelling about the possibility of right to work passing now that you've got some obstacles out of the way. In Maine, right, state went federally blue, but the Democrat majority went from 14 to 4, right? So 10 Democrat incumbents ousted or losing open seats. That's very promising to see. Again, Maine's moving a little slower than New Hampshire.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I always want to see Maine come along. My heart is still in Maine, even as I suppose I'm cheating on Maine with New Hampshire. But.
The momentum is going. And then finally in Minnesota, right? So I think a lot of folks look at Minnesota, say, oh, that's a deep blue state. It's too far gone. Tim Walz. Well, thanks in part to Young Americans for Liberty, Tim Walz is coming home to a divided government, right? The House of Representatives in Minnesota, which was a Democrat majority for such a long time, is now deadlocked. It is totally tied. I think there is still one recount outstanding, but at the very least, he's going to come home to not a blue trifecta, but to now a divided government. So I think that's extremely encouraging to see Liberty outperforming, Trump and at the federal level, but also in these states where you look on the electoral map and you say, these are deep blue states. The state legislature tells a different story. And I think that's very encouraging, very exciting.
Awesome. Now, what would you say to folks who might say, well, this number is over 400 legislators. I saw it somewhere north of 420. What would you say to people who might be skeptical and wonder if you're like inflating those numbers? Maybe not all of these folks are like as great on liberty as we think. Like, what are the accountability structures that are in place here? Does Young Americans for Liberty ever do anything about folks who you help get elected who end up going bad and falling to the dark side?
100%. If I could take you on a tour of the office, and I know you've been to the office, but if I could take your viewers on a tour of the office, I would, and I would show them the Operation Win at the Door victory wall, which has several red X's across the framed photos of these candidates who won their election. So when people take them on the tour and they say, what are all these folks with red X's? And I say, these are folks who pledged to defend liberty, to champion fighting the establishment when they're elected, to do the right thing. And they broke that promise, and they were not showing a teachable spirit. And so we publicly kicked them out of the coalition, right? And it's not just that we will see them vote incorrectly, try and, let them know what they did wrong and see if they, budge or not. And some folks, again, the bills are so long, they don't know what they're voting for. They say, oh my goodness, I had no idea I voted for the increase. I'll never do that again. Scouts honor, hand to God. Those people pan out, which is good. But then you have some folks who say, well, you don't understand how things work around here. And, I can't compromise my ability to be in leadership because then I can get really good things done. But that's just an indicator that they're being spun, by the speaker or by the House Majority Leader. And they're too far gone.
You can be loved by the politicians, or you can be loved by the people, but you cannot choose to be loved by both.
100%. And all I'll add is that it's not just that we have a back and forth conversation with them and then say, sorry, you're out of the club, right? There are times, right? And I'm feeling nice, so I won't say which legislator in Idaho, but after several attempts to say, please don't vote for the gas tax, you understand why the gas tax is incorrect, why it's anti-liberty, why it's not solving any problems. This guy wouldn't budge. And we said, okay. And then we sent a lot of mail into his own district saying, this guy is voting for the gas tax. You need to pressure him. You need to tell him to change his vote. So even pressuring active members of the coalition to say, look, this is what we're capable of. Are you sure you're not going to change your vote? Sure you're not going to repent? And even still, that guy was committed to being a part of the establishment and just moving up and putting his career before his constituents. So we say, okay, clearly you can't be a part of our club. Press release, public statements, making sure everyone else in the state, our allies, know, hey, this guy's non grata or this gal's non grata. We're not here. We're here to make friends with champions. We're not here to make friends and just please everyone around us, because that's not how liberty advances, right? You're judged in part by your enemies. You're judged by how strong you hold to principle, right? Even in the face of pressure. And those are the type of people we want in the coalition. If you're not cut out for that, don't apply, and we might end up kicking you out. But if you'd love to stick around, we'd love to have you too.
Who are some of the rising names of kind of liberty champions in the legislatures that people should be aware of, and bonus points if some of them are from New Hampshire that you want to let people know about?
Absolutely. Well, I think you got to keep your eye on Josh Kaiser in Idaho. I think he's going to be a really good vote, really good champion. But the significance with him is he took out a 12-year incumbent sitting Senate president in Idaho, which is the biggest political loss for an incumbent legislator in Idaho in decades. And this guy's a total political newcomer, totally made in the Ron Paul mold. So you think you keep your eye on him because there's going to be a lot of eyes on him in Idaho because of the strength of who he took out. I think you also keep your eye on a new guy who just got elected in New Hampshire, Samuel Farrington. Right? He is a UNH student, a Yale member who took up the mantle and said, I'm not going to wait, until I'm old and balding and gray hair. I'm going to run for office now, at 22. And so he's in the state house now, a true young American for liberty who's in a position of power. Very excited to see what he can do. We'll be watching his career with great interest. Not so much a rising star, but someone who, I think everyone should keep their eye on. Adjacent state in Maine is Laurel Libby, of course, who won a contested re-election. She has made a lot of good enemies in Maine for standing up for some key issues on liberty. And so, I think there's a bright future for her in the neighboring state of Maine. I'd go through all 400, but I think those three in particular, a mix of rising stars and a mix of, people who are battle tested in this coalition.
Well, I will say about Laurel Libby, I'm very proud of her. I helped recruit her for the state house several years back, and she certainly has made a lot of enemies in politics, but she's built an amazing grassroots network on the ground that I really think is a model for all who are trying to build kind of grassroots networks to put pressure on the politicians and to achieve legislative and political change. And my only disappointment is when I decided to exit the Maine Senate, I tried to twist her arm to run for my Senate seat, and she decided the House was where she needed to fight. But it's all right. We got a Republican elected.
And there's always next year.
Maybe not a pure liberty Republican, but you know, I'm glad that my Senate seat didn't fall to a Democrat with my exit. Though Laurel is always on my case a little bit that I'm not allowed to recruit new movers to New Hampshire from Maine because they're trying to hope is not lost for the Pine Tree State that perhaps one day they'll get their act together and turn things around and throw off the shackles of tyranny that they've been living under with Democrats having trifecta control over the whole state for the last 8 years. So anyway, shout out to Laurel Libby and all the good people in Maine who are doing good work there, as in other states. Of course, I have a Maine and New Hampshire bias. Any final things you want to share with us, Sean? We've talked a lot about kind of the elections, of course, but anything else with Young Americans for Liberty that you'd like folks to be aware of before we wrap up today's episode?
Yeah, if you have any students, friends with kids in college who are interested in getting involved, and they can visit yaliberty.org, sign up to become an official member. If you want to stay attuned to everything we're doing, all of our social media handles are at YALiberty across all your favorite accounts. And again, especially in New Hampshire, right? I'm partial to New Hampshire. I pledge to be a reverse free stater someday, whatever you call that, because I grew up there, grew up in Chester, went to Pinkerton, moved away. But to anyone who's listening across the country, the best thing you can do once the legislative session starts running in your state, which is usually kicking off in January, is to pay attention and follow along to what is going on in the state house. They like to operate under a shroud of darkness. So, talk to your colleagues, read the paper, whatever you got to do, look on X. But pick up the phone and start dialing, right? There's nothing that scares an establishment legislator more than them thinking they're going to get away with voting incorrectly or voting present or not actually standing up for reducing government. And then they get an influx of calls from their own voters, their constituents, saying, I know what you're up to. I know what kind of man you are or woman you are, and you're not going to get away with it, right? That is how you move the needle. That is how you make change. You have that power, right? To paraphrase Spike Cohen, to change the outcome of legislation, to reduce the size and scope of government, to make your state more free. So please do pick up the phone and start dialing. If there's any town halls too, show up to those. But it takes an engaged to change the states for the better and to ultimately create a better future. So
awesome. Yeah, if you aren't politically feared, you will not be politically respected. You can be loved and manipulated by the powerful, or you can be feared and respected by them. And Young Americans for Liberty certainly embraces the model of being feared and respected. And that's the only way, right? As Thomas Jefferson said, when the people fear the government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. This is the way. And I certainly would encourage all who are watching, if you know college students who love liberty in New Hampshire, certainly reach out to Young Americans for Liberty. I will say, for the freest state in the nation with such a robust liberty movement, I don't know that we have the most robust chapters on college campuses in New Hampshire. That's something we have some room for improvement on because YAL is a great organization to get young people involved in the fight. So love to see kind of even stronger presence of YAL chapters on college campuses. Everyone's always complaining about how far left and socialist the college campuses are shifting in the state of New Hampshire. Well, the way to combat that is with strong Young Americans for Liberty chapters. So if you know a good young person, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, wants to help out, YAL is the place for them to connect. All right, Sean, I really appreciate you coming on to the show. By the way, rumor has it that sometime this month before December, you will be back in New Hampshire, and there might be karaoke taking place at an undisclosed location at an undisclosed time with a certain renegade statesman and some other friends. Is there any truth to these rumors?
Somewhere, what's the What did Mark Levin used to say? Like, somewhere in a bunker, right? Yes, there may be some karaoke in New Hampshire around that post-Christmas time. So who knows? Maybe you'll see some clips of Eric Brakey singing Ground Control to Major Tom, me singing Rocking Around the Christmas Tree. Who knows? Anything can happen.
Well, Kennedy from MTV did say my rendition of Space Oddity was the best karaoke song at all of YowCon this year. So, people maybe know her more from her show on Fox Business, but I think her credentials as a former host on MTV are more appropriate in this particular case. So I wear that with some pride. And I think at karaoke at that undisclosed place and time in December here in New Hampshire, I'm looking forward to a rendition of War Pigs, which I've been working on. So that'll be a lot of fun. And all the audience will wonder, where and when is this happening? We want to hear this. I'm sorry. But maybe if you just randomly stumble around to karaoke bars around New Hampshire for the next several weeks, maybe you will stumble upon us, but we'll keep the time.
It'd be better if it's organic,
Yeah.
Get out of the house. COVID's been over for a while. Go see some sights. I
will say to those who are who do have a hankering for karaoke, though, who are in New Hampshire, I believe that in just a few weeks, if you go to the fsp.org calendar, there is Liberty Karaoke taking place at the Shell Liberty Clubhouse for a Christmas party. So anyway, if you want your karaoke fix with good Liberty people, that's a great place for audience members to check out. All right, Sean, I know I gave you a final word already. Do you have any other final words? And
Liberty. My final word.
All right.
Best final word. The whole Merriam-Webster.
Make Liberty win in our lifetime. That's like combining the YAL and Free State Project slogans, which is, I think, the goal for all of us. Make Liberty win in our lifetimes. So, Sean, Themea, thank you so much for you and all the work everyone at Young Americans for Liberty is doing. We appreciate it in New Hampshire.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
All right, everyone, that's the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. As I mentioned, go to fsp.org. Check out our community calendar, all of the events taking place every single day, from hiking groups to knitting groups to cryptocurrency meetups to I've even seen there's like a Japanese language. Some libertarians like studying the Japanese language. They do meetups about that. Whatever your niche interest is, it's happening in New Hampshire. And if it's not happening yet, then I guarantee you, there are people who share your interests, who share your love of liberty, who would love to come to an event that you organize. And that's the beautiful thing of this bottom-up libertarian revolution happening in New Hampshire with the Free State Project. So check out our community calendar, check out our events, grab your tickets to Pork Fest and Liberty Forum. And of course, as I mentioned, our fundraising season, we are halfway to our goal. Every single dollar you donate between now and the end of the year will be matched dollar for dollar. We've raised $45,000, which is being matched. So we've raised $90,000. We've got another $45,000 to go between now and the end of the year. So as I'm making calls and talking to folks about why they should invest in our efforts to expand the Free State movement and to continue down the road to achieve liberty in our lifetime, you can go to fsp.org/give and make your most generous contribution, which will be worth double of what it would normally be. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Furthermore, my opinion is the Federal Reserve should be destroyed.